right. This is a lot of information to pack into an hour. So I will do my best to cover these design and construction requirements under the Fair Housing Act, as well as some common violations. I see that we have one question already, and I'd like to address that in terms of my own presentation. I cannot speak for Sarah's later, but I'll be going over the design and construction requirements that fall under the Federal Fair Housing Act, which can apply to a myriad of housing, whether it be affordable or we might be meaning federally funded or not. And I just unfortunately don't have time to get into the additional layers that apply in terms of design when multifamily housing is HUD or federally funded. But there is another layer. In short, for now, I'll say that law is called Section 504, and there are other design requirements that apply to federally funded housing. So I think I have to tap my screen to progress. There we go. We will be discussing the Fair Housing Act's design and construction requirements today. Multifamily housing, I think I'm going to take this moment to hide myself. You don't need to see me. You want to see my screen. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And the design and construction requirements under the Federal Fair Housing Act apply to what the law calls covered multifamily dwellings. These are designed and constructed for first occupancy after March 13th of 1991. This applies to the interior of these dwelling units, and it applies also to the public and common use areas of these multifamily dwelling projects. I stressed here that the design requirements apply to multifamily dwellings built for first occupancy after March 13th of 1991. If a building existed before March 13th of 1991, it would not have been subject to these design requirements when it was first constructed.
Oh.
Or if a building is first constructed after 1991, before 1991, but it undergoes renovations after 1991, the Fair Housing Act does not have a section that requires compliance and alterations of existing buildings. That would be a difference in Section 504 for federally funded housing. Those existing buildings undergoing alterations would still have some requirements. But under the Fair Housing Act, it's designed and constructed for its first ever occupancy after March 13th of 1991. What are these buildings? What is a covered multifamily dwelling? It is a building with 4 or more dwelling units. Full stop, that's it. If it's a building and it has 4 or more dwelling units in it, we need to consider it a covered multifamily dwelling for purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And then we need to know how many of the units in this covered dwelling are required to comply. If this building has an elevator, all of the units will be subject to these requirements. If the building does not have an elevator, then what the law calls the ground floor dwelling units will be subject to these requirements. So it isn't a minimum percent. It isn't a ratio based on a certain number and then it kicks in a minimum number. If this structure has 4 or more units, then we have to look at the Fair Housing Act. It could be a high rise with an elevator. Every single unit is covered. Or it could be a walk-up building. This law does not require the presence of an elevator. So it could be a walk-up building, and that would make the ground floor units required to comply. The types of housing subject to these design and construction requirements are far-reaching. Again, could be walk-up apartments, but they could be for sale. This could be a condominium building. It does not have to be rented only. It could be public housing. 4 or more units after March 13th of 1991. This law is not dependent on federal funding, whether it's a public or a private entity. It is applying to public housing, private housing, for rent housing, for sale housing. It could be student dormitories. It could be homeless shelters. we have 4 or more units, we need to look at these design requirements. Some housing is not covered. I can't stress enough, buildings with 4 or more units. So if these are detached single-family homes, it could be a brand new development that consists of 500 detached single-family homes. They will not be subject to these design requirements. Duplexes or triplexes, those terms can change meaning geographically or regionally, I'll say. A duplex or a triplex, what we're meaning here is a building with less than 4 units. Maybe it's a duplex that's 2 units. Maybe it's a triplex that's 3. If it's less than 4 in that building, it will not be subject to the requirements. Multi-story townhouses, or really I prefer to say multi-story dwelling units, are not subject to these requirements unless they're in a building with an elevator, because every unit in a building with an elevator is subject to the requirements. So if we're looking at multi-story dwelling units in a building with an elevator, then HUD requires that the elevator serve the primary entry level to the unit, and that primary entry level is what is required to comply, not the other levels in this multi-story dwelling unit. So that primary entry level covered by the elevator must comply with the 7 design requirements that we'll be getting into. It must include a compliant bathroom or powder room from those requirements, and it must include a compliant kitchen at that level. So multi-story townhouses, multi-story units, and non-elevator buildings are not required to comply. We just went over if they are in buildings with common elevators. Also, multi-story townhouses or units that have private elevators in the unit, that unit with the private elevator would be required to comply. If it's not a common elevator, it will not trigger coverage for the entire building, but it will for the unit that the elevator is present in. If there is no elevator in the building, and again, this law does not require that you put in an elevator. So if there is not an elevator, we need to determine where the ground floor units are located in this building. They may not be at grade. This law requires that if you have a covered multifamily dwelling, you must provide an accessible entrance on an accessible route, unless it's impractical to do it by the site, not design choices, such as having perhaps commercial or retail at grade, or a garage space at grade. The first level containing a dwelling unit is considered the ground floor under this law. So in a mixed use building, we could have our dwelling units starting at what we might call level 2. That's the ground floor for purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And that level must be located on an accessible route. Maybe it's an elevator this time. And all of those dwelling units would be required to comply. You could have a unit that is at grade, and that would establish the ground floor for the building, and you would not be required to provide vertical access to the rest of the floors. This is a long list of HUD-approved guidelines and standards that can be used to comply with the requirements once you've determined you're looking at a covered multifamily dwelling with dwelling units that are required to comply. The Fair Housing Act, as written in statute, is different than what we're familiar with, maybe under Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act, in that neither the statute or the regulations governed by HUD dictate what accessibility standard you must use to comply. It has been said that the goal was to give the design industry more flexibility than one single prescribed standard, and that HUD had the intention really of updating their own regulations on a more regular basis, similar to code cycle. And it's become evident over the years that that cycle to amend, approve, and adopt regulations just can't follow the same timing as building code revisions. And so what they've ended up doing over the years, for better or worse, is to adopt a list of what they call safe harbors that you can choose from to comply with the design requirements of this act. They've not sunsetted any of their historical safe harbors, but they've added on to the list, we'll say, over the years since '91. The first safe harbor is their very own HUD's Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines and a supplement that they added to it in '94. And the next one of HUD's I'll bring in is their own 1998 Fair Housing Act Design Manual. Those two HUD publications reference the ANSI 1986 standard. That combination is the basis of how this presentation has been put together in using HUD's own approved and published safe harbors. There are differences in those safe harbors and its references to the 86 ANSI as what you would find in the Michigan Building Code currently, and its reference to the more recent ANSI 2009 standard. I have tried to put a few of those differences into this presentation. Again, we're packing a lot into an hour. But recently, excuse me, at the beginning of this year, HUD pulled in the more recent ANSI standard 2009 as an approved safe harbor when it's used with the Fair Housing Act, HUD's regulations, and the guidelines, because you need those for scoping, when to determine you have a building that needs to comply. And then you use the ANSI standard for the technical criteria. They're also now referencing all of the recent IBCs. So this is so helpful for all of the states that have already adopted a version of the International Building Code with an ANSI reference, and it can help to streamline the state building code with these requirements. What these requirements are listed here. There are 7 design and construction requirements under the Federal Fair Housing Act. These requirements are listed in the statute as fairly broad, without prescription, or that is criteria on how to comply. So we arrive at the site, we need an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. We're going to typically encounter public and common use areas first. Those are required to be accessible. Once we get to the dwelling unit, we'll be looking at the door into the unit and other accessible doors and accessible spaces. And once we're through that door, we need an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit that is subject to these requirements. Now we get a good understanding that these requirements will not give you the same level of access as those units that are being made accessible due to maybe some HUD funding or being part of a public entity, housing authority, for instance. The requirements under the Fair Housing Act result in what we call a usable or adaptable dwelling unit. And so the light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and environmental controls need to be in an accessible location. There needs to be reinforcing in the bathroom walls for later grab bars, and usable kitchens and bathrooms, not necessarily accessible. What the statute is doing here is building a framework for a unit that hopefully could be modified rather easily and at a reasonable expense for someone who may need to heighten their features. Requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. As I mentioned earlier, when you've determined you have a covered multifamily dwelling, that is a building after March 13th of 1991 with 4 or more units, then the law requires that we provide an accessible route to an accessible entrance. This building presumably has dwelling units only. It is interconnected throughout this ground floor. There's no elevator. So all of these units on the ground floor are required to comply. This law requires that you provide at least one accessible entrance to all of these units. Not every entrance may be required to be accessible, but there may be more than one entrance that has been planned by design that would therefore have to be made accessible. But the law requires that you absolutely must provide at least one accessible building entrance on an accessible route. And this gives you a visual of where an accessible route needs to start and connect to throughout the site. This requires an accessible pedestrian route that is intended for use by pedestrians and that is safe for people with and without disabilities from all site arrival points to public and common use spaces and dwelling units that are subject to these requirements. So one site arrival point could be a bus stop near the property line. The public sidewalk is going to meet up somewhere with the property line, even the public street. These are site arrival points, and we need our accessible pedestrian route to start there. And then it needs to connect to these, maybe this is the leasing office or clubhouse. Here's our apartment building. Here's another common building or apartment building. Our route needs to get to all of these spaces. An accessible route is required to public and common use spaces, but you can use a vehicular route if the site is impractical to, install an accessible pedestrian route. There are certain conditions that must be met, and they are laid out very well in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. Basically, it's where our finished grade is going to exceed the maximum slope of a ramp, 8.33%, and that these conditions are beyond the control of an owner to provide an accessible pedestrian route. You are allowed to use a vehicular route if you provide accessible parking at the dwelling units and you provide accessible parking at the amenity that is otherwise unreachable by an accessible pedestrian route. I will take this moment to say that HUD is expecting accessible pedestrian routes, routes intended for pedestrians, not vehicular routes only. So what are the general requirements for an accessible route? I think I need to pick up my speed. I'm looking at the time, so I will talk fast. We need a 36-inch wide route. We need a sidewalk slope. This is just going to be a walking path, a running slope between 0% and 5%. That's this route here. The cross slope of these routes, or that is the angle at which we are fighting against to travel along this route, the maximum cross slope is 2%. And then if we are above 5%, we're on a ramp. We cannot go any higher than 8.3% or it's not considered accessible. So any path that is in this range of 5 to 8.3% is going to be considered a ramp. That's the maximum slope. And this is what we're looking at as criteria for ramps. There's a landing at the bottom. There's a landing at the top. If our ramp run is over 30 feet, we need intermediate landings. We need handrails on both sides. And we need edge protection to keep perhaps the wheel of a walker or the front wheel of a chair from coming through the bottom rail and extending over the edge. We encounter curb ramps everywhere that we come from accessible parking or where we are crossing an intersection. So where our accessible route encounters a curb, there must be a compliant curb ramp. ANSI, the ANSI standard goes over 3 primary curb ramp designs: flared, built up, and returned. They all have a maximum running slope on the ramp portion of 1 and 12. The flares have a maximum slope of 1 and 10. Probably one of the most successful ramp designs, though, that we see is the inline or parallel ramp, because a person can travel along maybe the access aisle of parking, or they've come through a well-marked crosswalk, and they have a level landing here by which they can turn left or right, and then they're dealing with this running slope here. Other ramps that have flares, especially the flared one here, not the built up, that we see more often in alterations, because we don't want the curb ramp running into the access aisle or the intersection. But on this flared ramp, it takes up a lot of space. We need at least 36 inches here at the top of the ramp. And if someone is traveling perpendicular, they might be fighting this flare to come down here rather than following the ramp slope to a level landing, making it much easier to make a turn. And here's just another illustration of curb ramps. This is the problem here that we often see. This may not have been designed to be wide enough. And so we might end up having this portion, which is required to be compliant, actually existing along this portion, and the flares will make the slopes non-compliant. Wheel stops, or a well-designed route with an additional width to allow for vehicle overhang, is also important to maintain the minimum width of our accessible route as we're passing along parking. The accessible route has limitations in level changes. We've just discussed how we could get over those, but if we're not going to, then we need to be able to maintain this throughout the lifetime of the project. A vertical change can only be 1/4 inch. If it's over 1/4 inch, then we're really looking at a 1/2 inch maximum where we can bevel at 1 and 2. Once the level change is over a 1/2 inch, then we need to look at ramping slopes. So property maintenance is critical on these projects, especially over time where there can be settling or tree rooting. And this is our accessible route that is now highly deficient in these vertical level change restrictions. And so here's a list of common violations that we will see under requirement 1 or for our accessible route. Slopes and cross slopes exceeding the maximums, vehicle overhang reducing our width, changes in level that exceed 1/4 inch, ramp slopes that exceed 8.3%. This actually is a little hard to see in the photo now, but this is pretty steep. Maybe it'd be fun in the winter. And curb ramps. Curb ramps are often a problem. Site impracticality is allowed for under requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route, because Congress understood when they wrote this law that there would be areas in our nation where it would be considered impractical to make these buildings accessible, but that we would still be building. And so HUD's Fair Housing Act Design Manual, there's a link here, and I have another slide at the end of the presentation, really does give the most detailed information on how these tests are supposed to be laid out, conducted, and kept on record, because they will determine a permitted reduction in the number of compliant units, and it could lead to a building that is entirely exempt based on this impracticality. We don't have time to get into those details today. One thing that is very important to note, though, is that if the building has an elevator or is planned to in new construction, site impracticality cannot be claimed. The work that's done that would allow for an elevator to be in a building, has been stated that that should be enough to be able to grade for accessible routes. So buildings with elevators are not permitted to claim site impracticality. Requirement 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. As I mentioned earlier, HUD's regulations reference the ANSI 86 standard, and they still do allow use of that standard. I don't know of any states, maybe there are one or two, that still look to the 86 because of its reference in the guidelines. But HUD does also recognize and approve current ANSI standards. So we could be looking at the 2009 now and would be for Michigan projects. So the public and common use areas have to be accessible, and that is done by meeting the ANSI standard in these spaces. The Americans with Disabilities Act was actually passed just after the Fair Housing Act was amended to include people with disabilities as a protected class and these design requirements. So the Fair Housing Act as a law doesn't require an overlap of compliance with the ADA. It didn't exist yet. But I'm taking this time to note that public spaces, places of public accommodation on these sites, typically we'd be talking a sales or leasing office, and its parking and its restrooms are also subject to the ADA standards. Spaces that are not typically intended for the general public, this might be our game room, our fitness center. Those, if they are intended only for use by guests and residents, they're not places of public accommodation. They would not be subject to the ADA standards in a private project, but they would be subject to being accessible still under the ANSI standard. I just checked the Q&A really quick. Sorry for the silence there. Washing machines and dryers.
Amber, we can cut in with some questions, or we can do it at the end, but we're making note of the questions. So
okay, then we will pick those up at the end, hopefully. One major thing that comes under common use amenities is mailboxes. And this is because the scoping documents and even the standard don't cover HUD's current position, which is that all mailboxes that serve covered dwelling units must be within an accessible reach range. Now in Michigan, we're looking at 15 to 48 inches because we reference ANSI 2009 within our building code for accessibility requirements. HUD still recognizes the 86 standard, so there could be some projects looking even up to 54. But for Michigan projects, we're really looking at this 48 max top range in a high-rise elevator building. This is all of the mailboxes in the building. It can be a huge design challenge. Oops, click, there we go. And another thing that's important in public and common use areas, not only at accessible routes, but also our general circulation routes are reduced vertical clearance, or that's headroom under stairs. These are also considered protruding objects, essentially something that could be unsafe for people with visual impairments who might use a cane to guide themselves around obstacles. Something that's between 27 inches and 80 inches, they're not likely to pick up with the sweep of their cane and could walk into this and be injured. Recreational facilities are required to be located on an accessible route per HUD's guidelines. Now with newer IBCs and ANSI standards, we could be looking at, for state project requirements, a higher level of accessibility in these recreational facilities. So far, there's a similar exemption for what we call type B dwelling units in the ANSI standard. These are dwelling units intended to meet fair housing, where the swimming pool is required to be located on an accessible route, but a lift into the pool, so still is not required. That was something that came from HUD's guidelines and hasn't been picked up yet in private residential projects. We need an accessible route to at least one of each type of recreational facility. If we have 3 tennis courts, we need an accessible route to at least one of those tennis courts. Some common violations we see in public and common use spaces. We talked about the reduced clearance under stairs. We see a lot of violations in toilet rooms and bathing rooms, grab bar locations, toilet center lines. These are things you're probably very familiar with. Knee space under sinks in bathrooms. Compliant common use kitchen design is also something that we see issues with often. Moving on to requirement 3, usable doors. I like to make a distinction here. The doors leading to public and common use spaces are required to be accessible doors. They need to meet all of the requirements of the ANSI standard: clear width, maneuvering clearance on both sides, threshold restrictions, accessible hardware, opening force. These are all the provisions that would make a manual swinging door fully accessible to meet these standards. And so these are the doors leading into the building, public and common use amenity spaces, and the door to the dwelling units.
Amber, Amber,
yes.
You go back to the previous slide. It just fits this question so well. By Jennifer, does an accessible route include an automatic door opener?
A manual door can be considered an accessible door if all of these provisions are met. So I think I'll answer it this way first. A door does not have to be an automatic door to be considered an accessible door occurring along an accessible route. If an automatic or power operated door is planned for, then it also does have to meet certain requirements. Sarah later will be talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications, and she might get into what sort of accommodations or modifications people may need to seek when they're dealing with opening force of a manual swinging door, which can be a problem at fire doors, and we know this. That would be an overarching life safety requirement, and the standards allow opening force to be set under that administrative authority rather than these accessibility requirements. So perhaps Sarah will get into that later if that's where the question is coming from. In my experience, it often is.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we're looking at accessible hardware, minimum clear width of the door, opening force. There is a door pressure gauge you can use to test the pressure. It's 5 pounds max on interior doors. Exterior doors this has moved out of the standard for exterior doors. There are too many variables. Wind resistance. I'm here in Michigan. I'm in Michigan too, by the way. We can be looking at ice buildup, and then again, fire doors. We're looking at threshold limitations on accessible doors, maneuvering clearance on both sides. The ANSI standard will give you exactly what these sizes are for door maneuvering clearance, and depending on which way you approach the door. Within a dwelling unit, now we're through the door to the dwelling unit. That's an accessible door. Now I'm in this Fair Housing Act covered dwelling unit. It's adaptable or it's usable. And almost everything goes away about the door except the width. I'm no longer required to have accessible hardware, opening force, or maneuvering clearances. And my width has gone from a minimum 32 to a nominal 32. This is really to allow for a standard 34-inch residential door within these dwelling units. So a 34-inch door typically will yield a usable opening of a nominal 32. HUD's design manual calls it 31 5/8. The ANSI standard, the 2009, is 31 3/4. This is important for designers. When you're selecting your doors, you need to pay attention to the thickness, because that will reduce the opening width and can get you to less than 31 3/4. This applies to all doors intended for user passage within the unit. It could even be into a large walk-in closet. So some common violations we see under requirement 3 is that maneuvering clearance has not been provided at doors and gates. I think I see this far more at gates. Threshold height is often a problem, and the opening force and closing speed also are often a problem. Requirement 4, we have arrived at the site. We've successfully, on a pedestrian route, gotten into the building. We've successfully traversed to the door, and now we are in the unit. We need an accessible route into it and through it. So this is an illustration from HUD's Fair Housing Design Manual. We've entered through our accessible door here, and now this route is required throughout the unit to go through doors intended for user passage and to connect to the clear floor spaces that are required at fixtures and appliances. And then to connect to, though with some permitted conditions that I'll get to, at a secondary exterior door that leads to a private patio, deck, or balcony. This is where our 36-inch wide route needs to get us to. Some unique design features are still permitted in these units. We used to see sunken features. They kind of went away, and they seem to be coming back into design trend. So you can have a sunken feature like this living room that we see on the left, but it cannot interrupt the accessible route to other spaces required to be on an accessible route. It can't interrupt the route to the bathroom. It can't interrupt the route to the kitchen unless we provide access through it. You can have a loft space in these units. So a loft would be open to the surrounding space and no more than 33 1/3% of the space below. So what we cannot have located on this loft is any feature that's required to be on an accessible route within a single level unit. We can't put a bathroom up here. All of the bathrooms would be required to be on an accessible route. It would be unlikely that we'd put a kitchen up here, but we don't put the kitchen up here. It's required to be on an accessible route. So you can have a loft space, but it does have limitations. Flooring transitions and door thresholds, they occur along the accessible route, and so we are limiting abrupt level changes within the unit as well. We are looking at the primary entrance threshold here. So the interior finished floor, the top of the threshold, and the exterior surface are really what we're looking at. The top of the threshold can be under HUD's guidelines, no more than 3/4 inches from the finished floor to the top of the threshold. On the exterior side of the door, because of a combination of things, we're allowed 1 1/4 inches from the finished surface to the top of the threshold. At a secondary door, leading to a private patio deck or balcony, the accessible route can be interrupted more than what we had just looked at for the primary door. This was a recognition primarily to our coastal regions and water and rain infiltration, And so, for instance, in Florida. So at these secondary exterior doors, HUD's guidelines allow for not only this 3/4 inch threshold height from the inside of the finished floor to the top of the threshold, but they allow from the finished floor to the outside surface, if it's impervious, where water will settle and not drain through, up to a 4-inch completely vertical step down for a total of 4 3/4 inches from the, we'll say maybe it's a concrete patio surface to the top of the door threshold. Some common violations we see here will be no surprise. Entry door threshold problems, patio door threshold problems, and then at flooring transitions. So we really need to be careful where we're transitioning between maybe linoleum to carpet, tile to carpet, or any difference therein. If we can keep a level transition, that's best for everyone. But if we can't and we need a strip like this, then we have to follow the 1/4 inch vertical or 1/2 inch max with 1 and 2 bevel. 10 minutes, I'm gonna fly. Light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls need to be located at an accessible height within the dwelling unit. Light switches, outlets, thermostats, security devices. Think about things that are used by residents on a regular basis. Those controls that are not covered, controls on movable appliances like microwaves. If the control is on the hood over a range, it's not required to comply. If it's on a switch on the wall, that switch is required to comply. Special use wall outlets, we don't see telephone jacks much anymore. But circuit breaker panels, specifically in looking at HUD's 98 design manual, these would not be subject to reach range, but in looking at newer ANSIs, like the 2009, they are required to be within that ANSI reach range. So we need to, oops, I did this wrong. I'm sorry. I corrected this and I went the wrong way. So what we need to do is have the uppermost operable part no higher than 48 inches above the floor. If our outlet or switch is located over an obstruction, like a kitchen counter, then it needs to come down to 46 inches because we can't reach as far over an obstruction. I should be putting this line at the wall outlet to the bottom receptacle. That's where I meant to put it. Every operable part in this receptacle, both of these, need to be within reach range. And unfortunately, I can't do anything with this line right now, but it needs to come down to the bottom outlet. Oftentimes, electricians will be measuring to the center of the box. And if we measure or design that at 15, then we put in our flooring. It isn't that both of the outlets will be within reach range anymore. So again, please ignore this going to the top outlet. It needs to go to the bottom one. And the common violations, it would be located over 48 inches, the outlet or switch, the reach depth may be more than what is permitted if it's located over an obstruction. Requirement 6 is reinforced walls for the later installation of grab bars. In these adaptable dwelling units, it's not required to have the grab bars installed, but it is required to have reinforcing that will allow for future grab bars. HUD's guidelines, I really don't know why, truly,
Amber,
after all these years.
Amber, I got a question on the grab bars.
Yes.
Question is, does requirement to provide reinforcement in the walls of the bathroom for handrails include reinforcements that are lower and would allow for attaching a shower or bath seat?
That's a very good question. There is one condition for showers only where reinforcing for a shower seat would be required. That is if there is one shower, let me say this right. There's one bathing fixture in the unit. It is a shower and it measures 3 by 3. What we're looking at here is it's the only bathing fixture in the unit. So it has to be considered quote unquote usable. And if someone opts for the 3 by 3 size, we put the reinforcing in for a seat because we are building the framework for a transfer shower. Reinforcing for bathtub seats, not required under this law at all. Any other shower, or if there's more than a shower in the unit, then that seat reinforcement requirement goes away. So we're looking at surrounding toilets, the wall surround of bathtubs, and the wall surround of showers. If you're familiar with the ANSI standard and the minimum sizes of grab bars, you might notice that these minimum areas here and here, so at the side of the toilet and behind the toilet, are not the same length as an ANSI compliant grab bar. What has happened in the ANSI standard for type B dwelling units is that exceptions have been built in to match these guidelines of HUDs that will say if the wall area does not allow for a grab bar of that size, then you can come down to, say, this size, 24 inches behind the toilet. If a toilet is going to be positioned between two fixtures, very common, like a bathtub and a vanity, or maybe it isn't surrounded by walls at all, then we're still required to provide reinforcing for a sidebar. In this case, it would be enlarging or increasing the size of the reinforcing behind the toilet to allow for a fold down bar. Or, and I don't know that I ever see this actually planned for, we could use floor reinforcing for a floor mounted bar. Here we are at bathtubs. We have this area on the rear wall that would allow for two back wall bars. The ANSI standard now would also require a vertical bar at the control end of the bathtub, and so we would need reinforcing for a vertical bar here to comply with ANSI requirements. The common violations we see, I would say primarily, is that reinforcing hasn't been planned for all of the units that are covered, or maybe it hasn't been planned in every bathroom. So these reinforcement requirements do apply to every bathroom in the unit, even if that particular bathroom isn't considered a usable one, which is what we'll be getting into. Requirement 7, usable kitchens and bathrooms. There are some general requirements in the kitchen: clear floor space at appliances, a clearance in the kitchen between opposing elements, and then some additional clearance in U-shaped kitchens. Clear floor space at fixtures is required to be 30 by 48 inches. This is the basic footprint of a small manual wheelchair that we see throughout these standards. And so there must be a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space at the sink, at the range, oven, cooktop, at the refrigerator, at the dishwasher. Typically oriented in a parallel orientation, unless we are in a public and common use space, and then we might see a requirement for forward orientation at the sink or a cooktop, but not in the usable dwelling units. Centered on the range, centered on the refrigerator. In the ANSI standard, or I'm sorry, on the sink, I said refrigerator. Centered on the range, centered on the sink. In the ANSI standard, because the style of refrigerators varies so greatly, they have now worked in language for this clear floor space, not to be directly centered on this appliance that has a door that you need to open, but to be offset from the center. The minimum clearance in these kitchens is 40 inches within the kitchen. At least 40 inches is required between opposing elements, countertops, walls, and appliances. This excludes door handles and pulls or the hardware on the appliance. You can see the dimension line here is going to the face of the refrigerator, and it's excluding the refrigerator handles. I like to show you here in plan. This 40 inches is measured at the narrowest point. Refrigerators these days are monsters. Ovens are getting big again too, or here's the oven. And so we need to be watchful of how deep our appliances are. If we're only measuring between the countertops, but some of our appliances protrude more, we may not have 40 inches in the kitchen. HUD's Fair Housing Design Manual has a unique requirement for U-shaped kitchens, and it is conditioned on whether there's a sink, cooktop, or range at the base of the U-shape. Because a parallel clear floor space is required for that particular fixture, sink, cooktop, or range, HUD requires a 60-inch circle at the base of the U, so a person using a chair can maneuver to parallel at that appliance. The ANSI standard now requires a minimum clearance like this between everything in the entire U-shaped kitchen, not only a circle at the U. HUD's manual in a U-shaped kitchen allows you to reduce that 60 inches if you've provided knee space under the sink or cooktop. You cannot do that under the ANSI standard now. That would not be considered compliant in one of these units. If we're looking to say ANSI 2009, it's still a U-shaped kitchen. It doesn't matter what is at the base of the U, and you need the 60 inches. Some common violations that we see here: the clear floor space is not centered where it's supposed to be. The minimum clearance between opposing elements has not been provided for, often because of the appliance projection into the kitchen. Removable cabinets for sinks, and designing to minimums and maximums. These ranges are built in. Your tolerance is there if you give yourself room within the range. If you design to the minimum or maximum in the field, there are going to be issues. All right, usable bathrooms. I know I'm going over time, but I think I can get through this. Usable bathrooms. Again, these are not accessible. These are considered usable so that they can be modified later. In the usable bathroom, there are some general requirements. You need a clear floor space beyond the swing of the door so you can get in and shut the door behind you. And you need clear floor space at certain bathroom fixtures. So here's our clear floor space beyond the swing of the door. We can get in, close the door behind us. We may not be able to turn around. There are two different bathroom design options for these usable dwelling units: A bathroom and B bathroom. HUD's design manual calls them specification A and specification B. The ANSI standard calls them option A and option B. You can choose A or B. It is designer's choice. If there's only one bathroom in the unit, you can choose A or B. If there's more than one bathroom in the unit and you decide to choose the A option, those options must be complied with in all of the bathrooms in the unit. If you choose the B option, you can apply that to only one bathroom in the unit, and it's the bathroom of your choice. Common requirements in the A and B bathrooms. They both require a clear floor space at the vanity that is centered on the sink for a parallel approach. You can provide a forward approach, but you have to provide knee space, and you can use removable base cabinets. This is to show you two things. If I'm doing a parallel approach at the sink and I have to center my clear floor space on the sink, I need at least 24 inches off the wall. If I want a smaller vanity than 48 inches, I can do that, but I need to offset the sink so I can get it centered at the clear floor space. There's also the same clearances required around the location of the toilet. These are different from the design manual now to particularly the ANSI 2009 standard. The size of clearance, this 48 by 66 that you see here, or the 48 by 56, those have not changed. They're dependent on the direction of approach to the toilet. That's the first requirement, the clearance around the toilet. Where you put the toilet in the clearance has changed a little. HUD's design manual requires 18 inches absolute from the side wall, and then 15 inches at least to any other overlap into this clearance. That other overlap can only project 24 inches into the toilet clearance. If we're not next to a sidewall, maybe it's a bathtub, we have an 18-inch minimum requirement. But if we're looking at the ANSI standard, and that's what we'll be looking at in Michigan, especially for new construction, now this is the 16 to 18 range for a remaining clearance of 33 inches behind the toilet if we've put in this overlap for 24 inches max. So the primary difference here is we're no longer looking at a very problematic absolute dimension in the field of 88 inches, but to a more workable range of 16 to 18 for the toilet location. Clearance at the bathtub shower combo, not shower stalls, but a standard bathtub shower combo unit. It's a large clearance, but in the A bathroom, the toilet can overlap it. And of course, the lavatory can overlap the toilet clearance. What we're really left with is a 30 by 48 inch wheelchair clear floor space that's perpendicular to the bathtub. There's no requirement for the location of the controls in the A bathroom. In the B bathroom, it is a 30 by 60 clear floor space, no overlap allowed. And the toes of the clear floor space need to align with the control wall of the bathtub. Common violations here, clear floor spaces aren't centered on the lavatory. A huge one I see is that we don't have 30 by 48 inches beyond the door swing. I see that a lot, especially in compartmentalized bathrooms, where we may have, let's say we have a Jack and Jill double vanity. As soon as we go into the bathroom, then we have a privacy water closet compartment with a door. We have to have 30 by 48 inches beyond the swing of both doors for each compartment. Water closet location has been a problem. I think that this will help with the 16 to 18 range that's now approved. Again, designing to minimums and maximums instead of working within the middle of the ranges. This one that says both lavatories not designed to be compliant in A bathrooms, that has actually gone away in the ANSI standard. If you choose option A, only one lavatory has to comply. And that wraps up 7 design and construction requirements under the Fair Housing Act with their common violations. Steve mentioned, and I share this with you, that HUD does have a program called Fair Housing Accessibility First. I'm no longer on that program, but the website is there. I don't know how much activity is on it right now, and you can try the information line. If you would like to contact me, there's my contact information as well. You can email me or give me a call. And I'm going to turn it.
Well, I have a couple questions.
Yes, I was going to say back over to Steve to get to the questions.
Here we go.
Okay.
Should washing machines and dryers be accessible?
In public and common use spaces, at least one of each type of laundry equipment is required to comply fully with the ANSI standards requirements for laundry equipment. In the dwelling units, the short answer is no. And a little bit more detail is that now in the ANSI standard, in these dwelling units, you do need a clear floor space in front of the equipment, but there isn't a requirement that say the door opening or the operable parts be in reach range.
Okay, another question. For recreational purposes, if a complex has a pool and the complex accepts Section 8 vouchers, but not necessarily direct funding from HUD? Are they required for the pool area to have a lift and accessible showering change areas?
So Sarah might get into this a little bit later. Vouchers, I think I'll start with this. Vouchers that a person can use at different properties, that's a tenant-based assistance. And in that case, the law reads that the tenant is the one that's, so to speak, federally funded. So that would not be a design trigger under Section 504, and that housing provider also would not have to pay for that modification. At a Section 8 project-based property, where the project is the direct recipient of the funding, then they would be expected to pay for modifications. I don't know the details of how that works with the level of their funding and what they have to show as available, undue burden, et cetera.
Okay, and
go ahead, Steve.
No,
I was going to
ahead.
say in design and construction, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, so far we're looking at access into the water is not required. But if we have a rinsing shower, then there are some requirements that we would apply to that rinsing shower.
And are there any changes to these requirements depending on the number of bedrooms? Meaning, would there be say someone needs someone else to occupy a unit to assist a person with a disability?
That would probably be dealt with under a reasonable accommodation request to be able to transfer units. And now I think we might be getting into Section 8 assistance and number of bedrooms and what we might need for other things, caregiver, medical equipment, which is just not a part of these design requirements. But Sarah might get into that as she comes in.
Yeah, this is maybe a little one that looks like from the enforcement side. Does anyone have an inconspicuous way to measure slope during a test?
An inconspicuous way. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm trying to put my face back up, but I haven't figured out how to do it.
I think you're up. I think your face
I
is
am.
up.
Oh, I just can't see myself. That's okay. An inconspicuous way. That's a good question. Boy, a baby stroller. We can't really pull shopping carts out. Not so much. I mean, really, we need a level to find out what the slope is or the cross slope. An inconspicuous way, this is a guess of mine in my own experience, is to have something on wheels and see how much drag you get, how much pull there is. Maybe you have a friend who uses a chair.
Yeah. Okay, is a wheelchair ramp a common use area?
Mostly, yes, because a ramp is going to be required wherever our accessible route is encountering level changes. And so those requirements are going to apply in any space that is considered public and or common use, but not within the dwelling unit. So